Well, by now, we've got the establishment of the American government that would probably resemble something that you and I would know and recognize if we saw it. We've got the Constitution that was ratified in the late 1780s, and we also saw the addition of the Bill of Rights. So we've got the infrastructure in terms of how our government is going to function, who's got what power and what limits on that power there are. What we need to talk about now is the establishment of presidencies. That's probably about the best way that I have to describe it when it comes to what we're going to talk about now. Now, in 1788, George Washington was elected President of the United States. And if you take me long enough, one of the things that you're going to find out is, that I'll tell you that is, one thing that Americans love to do, they love to do this. They love to elect war heroes. Well, in 1788, there was no bigger hero in the United States than George Washington. He was the commander of the Continental Army. He was a hero, and so he overwhelmingly won the election of 1788. Now, one thing that I'd like you to be mindful of, this is before the day and age of political parties. It's before the day and age of, political tickets. In other words, in 2012, Barack Obama was running with Joe Biden as his vice presidential candidate, whereas Mitt Romney chose Paul Ryan to be his vice presidential candidate. So anyway, that's not the way that things worked. And the way that they did work is whoever came in second in the popular polling, that was the individual that would become vice president. So in this case, that would be John Adams. John Adams is now vice president. The other thing that's probably important to understand is when we go out and we vote for a president, we're not really electing him or her directly. What we're telling is representatives in the Electoral College, this is how we would like you to cast your electoral ballots. And for those of you that have studied politics, you'll know how the Electoral College works. Each state has a collection of representatives, and the bigger the state, the more representatives you have. So Texas has 55 representatives because it's a bigger state, there's more people that live here, whereas Wyoming only has, I believe, 2, I'm not for sure, but anyway, it's relatively small. So the idea was simply, back in 1788, was to simply, have the guy that won the most amount of votes, he would become president, and down the line, okay? Now, later on, a year down the road, in 1789, we see the establishment of the Judiciary Act. Now, the Judiciary Act, we'll see another one of them in due time, but what this does in 1789 is it establishes a collection of federal appeals courts, okay? Now, if you know anything about the legal system, when a court renders judgment, if you're not satisfied with that judgment, in other words, you feel that the jury was biased or whatever the case was, you can appeal it to a higher court. And in the 21st century, the highest court in the land is the Supreme Court, and it can't go any higher. You can't appeal it above and beyond the Supreme Court, okay? But what the Judiciary Act is doing is kind of establishing something that's similar to a Supreme Court in the sense that it has the final say in terms of the appeals process. It's also explaining what the law is. Now, you've got your 3 branches of government. You've got your executive. George Washington, the president, is in charge of executing the laws. You've got your legislative, right? That would be Congress, and they're in charge of passing laws, making laws. And you've also got your judiciary branch, judiciary, sorry. Anyway, it's in charge of reviewing the laws and saying what the law is. Now, this being the case, we're still a few steps away from a government that you and I would know. We need to talk about the establishment of a presidential cabinet, okay? Now, for those of you that do not know what a presidential cabinet is, it's a collection of advisors. Think about the job of the president. He or she has to, be 10 places at once. He or she needs to pass policies and make decisions regarding the economy at the same time that they make a decision regarding the military, at the same time that they make a decision about what's going on in the realm of agriculture and commerce, and the list goes on and on and on. So the simple fact of the matter is, it is really beneficial to have a collection of experts in their field, to do nothing but study and advise the president on one particular aspect of American governance, okay? I'm going to talk to you about two individuals today, and the first thing I'd like you to know about these two cabinet members, they were slam dunks, home runs, whatever sports analogy you choose to use. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were really, really good selections when it comes to Washington's cabinet. Let's start with Hamilton. Now, Hamilton grew up in an accounting house. He was a lawyer and an accountant by trade, and so therefore it made him a natural fit to become the Secretary of the Treasury, okay? The guy that's going to advise the president in terms of what we ought to be doing in terms of money policies, okay? Now, what I need you to know about Alexander Hamilton is, in addition to being a really good selection, he also published really more than that, but three groundbreaking reports. First, a report on public debt. Alexander Hamilton wanted the federal government, not the state governments, but the federal government to assume the debt of all the states, right? Now, you have to understand that that was controversial, considering some states had more debt than other states did, and so why would you force a state like, let's say, Connecticut to pay the same amount of money to paying down an overall debt as a bigger state like Massachusetts that had ran up much more debt? Well, the simple fact of the matter was it was simpler. And the other thing that Hamilton understood that many people don't understand is the way that credit works. In order to get credit, you need credit. And unless you have credit, nobody's ever going to lend to you, okay? Now, there's other aspects of this, aside from, simply establishing a good credit history and attracting investment from places like Holland and France and other investment-type countries, okay? The other nice thing about owning your own debt, when it's not owned by somebody else, is you can control it. If you need to lower the interest rate, you can lower the interest rate. If you need to suspend the debt, you can suspend the debt. If you need to raise the debt ceiling, you can raise the debt ceiling. Now, Hamilton understands this because this is what he's done for a living for his entire life, right? Thomas Jefferson does not understand it and consequently adamantly disagrees with Hamilton as it relates to the federal government controlling everybody's debt, okay? So that's report number one. Report number two is on a national bank. And Alexander Hamilton says the president should establish a national bank in North America. And the reason being is what banks do is they loan money, right? I mean, if you think about it, some people have these great ideas, right, for inventions and products around the house, but they don't have enough money to, market them. I mean, there's television shows where people have these ideas and they present them to these celebrity investors, and then they either say yay or nay when it comes to whether or not they'll invest. But you get the point of how banks are so important in that respect. But when that bank makes a loan and it gives it to that new business owner, that business owner has to do things like build factories or build buildings or hire workers. And what that does is it stimulates the economy, because when that factory worker goes home, after he's been paid for the construction job, he takes the money and he spends it on things. And what that creates is demand. He takes it to the grocery store, he takes it to the clothing shop, and he spends money. And what that tells the producers is you better resupply your stock. In other words, you better order more. And the only way that they have to order more is to continuously hire people and continuously keep them working. Hamilton understands this. Thomas Jefferson, maybe he does, but he certainly doesn't like the idea of a bank. All right? Jefferson understands that if you have a bank, then you're going to have bankers, and when you have bankers, you very well may have corruption. He saw what was going on in England at the time and the way that bankers had an enormous amount of influence on the political system. So he did not like the bank as it related to, he thought it had a corrupting influence on government. Now, in addition to just not liking it, he also felt that the president did not have any constitutional authority to establish it. I mean, Jefferson told Madison or asked Madison, show me where in the Constitution the president gets to do something like this. And Alexander Hamilton says it doesn't. But what it does say is that the president has a responsibility to protect the American people. Now, it doesn't mention a word in there about a bank, but Alexander Hamilton says it implies that because the president is in charge of protecting the people, he can establish a bank. Is a bank in the national interest of the American people? Yeah, it is for a lot of reasons, some of which we've talked about, some of which you can think about, right? But the simple fact of the matter is, Alexander Hamilton is citing something that historians call implied intent. In other words, it doesn't necessarily say so explicitly, but it implies, it kind of hints around that, you know, if it is in the best interest of the American people, the president can do it. He also issued a report on manufacturers, and one of the things that I need you to write down next to Alexander Hamilton's name is he wanted a strong industrial economy. He understood that when you make things, you get to export those things throughout the rest of the world. And when the French or the British or, you know, other countries throughout the world begin buying our stuff, that means that dollars and money are coming into the United States. Our stuff's going out, money's coming back in. Good thing, right? Well, anyway, in addition to all of this, it also sets up for the making of a powerful country. I mean, Hamilton understood that Britain was powerful, and one of the reasons it was so powerful had everything to do with its economy. Same thing could be said of France. Okay? So anyway, Alexander Hamilton wants a very vibrant, very industrialized economy, and he says, I don't care if we need to go through Europe and recruit all of these desperate, poor, and hungry immigrants, bring them over. I don't care if we need to go into the countryside and take ladies, take the women away from their families, put them in the factories. Of course, they'd be paid. He's not even above the use of child labor. This is something that he feels very, very strongly about, and if America does go down the road of industrialization, then everybody's going to benefit from this, according to Alexander Hamilton. Now, Thomas Jefferson could not have disagreed more on any one of those reports. He understood that there was problems with banks, and so one of the things that he insisted when it becomes increasingly clear that George Washington is not going to side with Thomas Jefferson, that he's not going to actually go out and refuse the bank. He insists that it have a shelf life. In other words, it would have a 20-year charter, and then whoever is in the White House, whoever is president 20 years down the road, if the bank has been a disaster, they can just not renew its charter. He also insists that it not be in New York City, which was the financial capital of the United States at the time, that it must be in Washington, where everybody, including people in Virginia like himself, could keep an eye on it. But he also agreed, actually disagreed, that there were problems as it relates to an industrialized economy. And the basic problem, and I want you to write this down next to Jefferson's name, was dependency. When you are tied to a job, you need the job. You don't really have a choice as to whether or not you get to quit or maybe look for something better. You're dependent upon that boss. And dependency is the opposite of independence. And so what Thomas Jefferson worried about was that industrialization would not only create a dynamic in the American economy where workers were dependent upon their boss and not really truly free, it would also make for a very small but very powerful business-owning class. I guess you could call this a capitalist class. Now, Jefferson was a world traveler, and he knew very well the problems of an industrialized economy because he had visited England on numerous occasions. And he saw these dark, scary-looking factories and the problems that they presented when it comes to the erosion of freedom and independence. Okay. Now, also for your notes, Thomas Jefferson was George Washington's selection for Secretary of the State. He's the guy that will engage other countries, other nations in diplomacy and advise the president in terms of what ought to happen to that end. Again, he hit a home run with this election, considering Thomas Jefferson, in addition to being a world traveler, was also just one of those people that was deeply versed in virtually any subject matter that you could possibly imagine. So he was a really good selection for Secretary of the State. Now, the kind of society that Thomas Jefferson was, and again it's worth writing down, is an agrarian society, a farming society. Now, the reason that he wants people to be farmers is he said, when you are a farmer, you're going to own your own land. You have to own your own land. And when you own your own land, you're independent. If you don't want to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go plow the field, you don't have to, right? I mean, the farm might fail and your family might starve, but that's ultimately your decision. Nobody's standing over your shoulder and saying that you have to do it this way or you have to do it that way, the same way that they are in industry. So what Thomas Jefferson wants is an agrarian society exactly opposite of Alexander Hamilton. And when people asked him, where is all of our stuff going to come from, he said, we're going to take what we're good at, which is farming, and we're going to trade for our worldly needs. So our metal products, our textiles, our finished goods will be traded with the Europeans, and we'll stick to what we know, which is farming. Okay. Now, George Washington served for 4 years, and then he decided it was time to have an election. And then he served for another 4 years, and then he decided to hang it up. There was no constitutional provision that said he could not serve another term if he wanted to. And so therefore, we have the election of 1796. In 1796, we see the emergence of John Adams. He becomes president. And one thing that I want you to know about John Adams, he was a Federalist. Right? The Federalists were a group of people that believed strongly in a much stronger federal government, and they also were more or less a political caucus. I hesitate to use the word political party, but they were a group of allied politicians, and all looked at the world and said, what we need is a stronger government. Okay. Now, for reasons that I don't really have time to get into, John Adams quickly becomes one of the worst presidents in the United States. In the late 1790s, the United States was involved in what historians call the quasi-war. It was a conflict predominantly on the high seas that involved the Americans and the French, and one of the reasons that John Adams felt that this was going so poorly for the United States was these immigrants coming over, and according to him, giving them, these immigrants were giving the French all of our military secrets. So one of the things that he passed in 1798 was the Naturalization Act. It had been the case that you would have to wait a few years if you were an immigrant and then apply for citizenship, 2-3 years. And what the Naturalization Act does is it extends it to 14 years. Now, 14 years is a long time, even by our standards. But back then, when people were lucky to live into their mid to late 50s, this is basically a lifetime. This is basically ensuring that no immigrant is really going to have a legitimate shot at becoming a card-carrying American citizen. Now, the only thing worse than the Naturalization Act is the Alien Act, also passed in 1798. What this does in the intermediary time is it severely restricts the amount of rights that immigrants, even those that are waiting to become naturalized, are going to have in American life. But the real kicker was the Sedition Act in 1798. Okay? Now, if you think about sedition or seditious speech, this is talk that's intended to create chaos, disorder, and in some instances, revolution. So, it could be something along the lines of, let's go burn down the White House, or something along those lines, or let's assassinate the President of the United States. Certainly that would qualify as seditious speech. But the way that the Sedition Act functions is it basically suspends all free speech. Now, we can all agree that it's probably, well, it's definitely not a good thing to talk about inciting riots, but it's something completely else to say the President of the United States is doing a terrible job, and I sincerely hope that he's impeached or he gets defeated in the upcoming election or something along those lines. for your notes, what the Sedition Act did was it said any kind of criticism of the government, right, the Adams administration, Congress, the military, whatever the case may be, that was seditious speech. So for all intents and purposes, what it did was it shredded the Bill of Rights. It said that First Amendment really doesn't apply anymore. Now here's the big crux of what we're talking about. Here's what I really need you to get out of John Adams and the Federalists. We are 2 presidents deep into American history, just 2. And we're already seeing the complete abuse of federal power. In other words, we're already seeing the problems of the growth of government. That government is getting so big that what it's beginning to do is trample on the rights that we were so careful and we were so cautious to protect as we were setting up the legal framework of the United States. We had laws on the books that said this is something that Congress will never pass, and here it is being passed. So this is one of the reasons that I believe John Adams is one of the worst presidents in American history. Not to say that he wasn't a great, brilliant intellectual and founding father. That's another story entirely. But the Sedition Act really does serve as sort of the poster child of, or excuse me, as abuse of government power. So what do? How do you get rid of a person like this? He's in the White House, and he's going to be there for a minute. Well, what we do in a democracy is we have an election. And if the people decide that this person hasn't been doing a good job or maybe is working contrary to their national interest, then you can vote them out of power. Well, the guy that runs against John Adams in 1800 is none other than his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson disagreed with John Adams on a lot of things, although they were friends. They were close friends, truthfully. I mean, even Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson were relatively close friends. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson forms a political caucus of his own. So the Federalists have their caucus, their group of politicians that see, a need for stronger government. The Democratic Republicans, right, I know that's confusing, but that was the caucus of Thomas Jefferson. They believed in the rights and the empowerment of the individual. In other words, they valued individual rights more than they did a stronger central government. Okay? So everybody matters, including the people at the bottom of the political ladder, so to speak. Everybody's vote counts, and everybody's voice ought to be heard. So in 1800, they run against each other, and Thomas Jefferson receives 72 electoral votes. We have now reached the point where we're using the Electoral College, to John Adams's 65. So he's president, right? Well, not exactly. Another candidate had ran that year, a guy by the name of Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr took home 72 votes. So you've got a tie. Now I want you to think back about like ancient history here, ancient Rome, ancient Persia, something like that. If you had 2 great and powerful men, both of whom could legitimately claim victory, just like just like Jefferson and Burr, how do you think that dispute would have been resolved? How do you think that they would have settled it? Most of you probably think through war, through violence. The streets of Rome would have ran red with blood, and this happened relatively frequently in the ancient world. But this isn't the ancient world. Now, one of the things that we've been coming back to over and over again has been America, the Great Exception, American exceptionalism. One of the things that sets us apart from great civilizations of the past is we are a nation of laws. And we are a nation that had maybe foreseen something like this coming when we had drafted the Constitution. And so when we had the tie in 1800, what happened was the Constitution said, if this ever happens, if you ever have an election where 2 people can claim victory, it'll be up to the House of Representatives. It'll be up to Congress to play the role of tiebreaker. And that's exactly what happens. It goes into the House of Representatives, and as a matter of fact, it's Alexander Hamilton, of all people, that drums up enough support to elect Thomas Jefferson, his one-time rival. Now, there are reasons for this, none of which we have time to get into, but it's Alexander Hamilton that brings along a lot of votes for Thomas Jefferson and ultimately makes him President of the United States in 1800. Now, what Thomas Jefferson called this whole process was the Revolution of 1800. Now, why was it revolutionary? It had nothing to do with war. As a matter of fact, it was the opposite of war. What you need to understand about the Revolution of 1800 was that it was a bloodless transfer of power. right? You had two great and powerful men, both of whom were legitimately claiming victory, and even though they had every sign in the world was pointing to this is going to be solved through violence and bloodshed, it's not. And so that's what I need you to understand, that it's part of the American exceptionalism in the sense that it was a transfer of power that did not lead to any kind of violence. It demonstrated that we were, in fact, a nation of laws, and we were an exception to the rule when it comes to most of these great societies of the past. Okay? Now, in the upcoming lecture, I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's presidency and how and why it's so instrumental with respect to American history.